Clare Daly.
Thanks, Kim
You have
Corlin.
18 minutes still, as you can see on the clock.
Okay, thank you. I think the bill has obviously been presented by the Minister as a positive measure, progressive move, and that's a tone which was accepted, or a viewpoint that was accepted by the spokespeople for the main opposition parties. And obviously on the surface of it, at the moment, if you can end up in jail for not paying a fine, well then an alternative of not being in jail can sound progressive. It is reprehensible that people should end up in jail for this, but I actually think that this move would be supported as well by even the most devout advocates of law and order, because on closer examination it's actually not a humanitarian move, it's not even a change in social policy. I think primarily this move is an economic decision, and when you look at the figures of the amount of people who do spend time in jail for fine defaults, as other deputies have said, over 8,000 people in 2012, representing a whopping 48% of all committals. You can see a very solid economic logic in why the state would move away from this, and the direction in which it's going actually is there was a 10% increase in committals for non-payment of fines last year. So already there is a substantial problem in this regard, and by removing the possibility of jail for non-payment of a fine, you could potentially almost halve your prison intake overnight. So in that sense it is sensible economically, but there is a lot more to this than meets the eye, and I do think we have to dig deeper, and I would like the Minister to expand on and deal with some of the issues posed by Deputy Wallace, because the issue really here shouldn't be about whether people should have fines deducted from their wages as an alternative to jail. The discussion really should be, is it appropriate to have monetary penalties or fines as a mechanism for dealing with breaking the law? Is it appropriate? Is it a deterrent? Does it reduce wrongdoing? Or does it make citizens behave better and correct them in their law breaking? And all of the evidence would say that it isn't. In actual fact, it's a fundamentally wrong way of looking at it and sends a totally wrong signal. Because in essence, what it is saying is, if you are a wealthy person, you can buy your way out of anything. And the more money you have, the more wrongdoing you can do, the higher the fines that you can pay. But if you're poor, you will be penalised for that, and in actual fact the state will end up making you poorer. So this is a bill actually for the poor, and it's a bill for people of limited means, and in that sense, to my mind, it's inherently discriminatory, because, you know, if you're wealthy, this bill will never apply to you because you've paid your fine, so they won't need to come in and deduct the money from your wages. So we need to take stock of the implications of what that message is saying to people. Now, in the majority of cases dealing with fines, they are in terms of road offences, traffic offences, theft, public order, drugs and so on. Relatively few of the fines would be appearing in the area of sexual assault. But I want to use sexual assault as an example because I think it shows how inappropriate it is to put monetary penalties on crimes, and I think it also demonstrates where this approach can lead up to. Deputies will be aware, obviously, of the controversy last year of Judge Desmond Hogan, who suspended a 5.5-year sentence of a 6-year sentence for an individual who was found guilty of rape. And the judge controversially decided that the perpetrator of this appalling crime could get out of it if he paid his victim €75,000, something which was absolutely abhorrent to the victim and her family. Less than 12 months later, the same judge ordered another guilty party to pay €10,000 in compensation to a woman that he was guilty of sexually assaulted. Now, the message here is you're putting a monetary value on crime. It sends out a message that if you can afford to, you can get away with any violation that you like. And in effect, to my mind, a fine system does the same thing, and it does penalise poorer people in society. A very significant number of fines which are handed out to people are in actual fact fines for poverty anyway. They relate to non-payment of, for example, TV licences, maybe your bus fare, credit card and so on. So inflicting and imposing a fine on somebody who's enduring economic hardship is only going to make their financial distress even worse, and actually could tee up a scenario where the only way out of it is for them to engage in crime to get the money to pay the fine in the first place. And I think that's lunacy, to be honest. I think other deputies have dealt with the fact the bill offers less flexibility in terms of the instalment system, which again is a bit of a joke, particularly in this time of economic hardship. The instalment system would have to be flexible, of course it would, if it was to be in place and to really take into account the ability to pay of an individual. And let's be clear, not just an individual, but their family, because there are other victims when the state imposes fines, because the person, if they're the breadwinner in the family, will then further financial hardship is imposed on poorer families. And I think we need to look at what has happened in that regard. There were 242 committals for fines in relation to the non-payment of a TV licence. And the deputies will be aware of the recent controversy which hit the headlines of John and Angela Young, an elderly retired couple who were brought before the court because they couldn't afford to buy a TV licence and they didn't have one. Now that licence was subsequently paid by a benefactor, but because they'd been to court and fined, couldn't afford the fine, so the guards ended up on their doorstep with a warrant for them. Absolutely ludicrous. The same weekend, incidentally, in the same area where there was a stabbing. So I think the guards would have better things to do, to be honest. And it's this type of lunacy which I think is at the root and at the heart of the overall fine system. And even to take a cursory glance of what happens in the United States does show you that fining people for crime can spiral for people who can't cope with the financial burden. And there is a lot of statistical analysis, which means actually further penalties are imposed later on. And in many cases, people end up in jail anyway, because, if you like, their debts run away with them and they can't catch up in the end. You know, there are a lot of individual stories, I won't go into them, but they are replicated and really reflect a justice system which in the United States criminalises poverty. And the director of the Justice Programme in New York University and Centre of Law says this is a growing problem nationally, particularly because of the economic crisis. And there's no reason why it wouldn't be any different here. Roughly 1/3 of US states today jail people for not paying off their debts, particularly in relation to court-related fines, fees and so on. And the American Civil Liberties Association have pointed out that this is in contravention of the United States Supreme Court and really egalitarian principles. And you do have as well, built into the system of a lot of states putting in, if you like, poverty penalties, extra fees on the basis of people who can't afford to pay in the first place, interest and so on. Alabama charges 30% collection fee. Florida allows private debt collectors to go in and add 40% surcharge in pursuing a court debt in that regard. And, you know, I think, you know, this is absolutely reprehensible. You have the ridiculous situation in North Carolina where people are charged if they use a public defender. So poor people who can't afford such costs don't have any legal representation. And there is a clause in this bill, which I find mad, that there is a 10% administration charge in the bill for people who require to have the fee paid off in instalments. So if you're poor and you can't pay it and you're required to pay by instalments, then you're penalised with an extra 10% charge. That's a joke, and not a very funny one. And in actual fact, it does highlight the fact that this potentially could be a money-making racket for the state and really put the state in a role of being a debt collection agency rather than the courts doing what they should do and oversee justice. And I do want to say that again, the point that these penalties also penalise. When you fine somebody, you're also fining their family. And for poor families with young children from deprived backgrounds and so on, or people whose parents or brothers and sisters might have to help to find the money to pay the fine, that's totally unfair, and it's obviously something that wouldn't affect or impact on wealthy citizens. So I think we do need to take into account these measures. I also think that an area that needs to explore it a bit more is it's a very dangerous precedent, and one which this government is getting very fond of using, about seeking to make deductions or enabling the state to pass legislation to make deductions from people's wages. Obviously, you made a great fist out of that in pursuit of the hate at home tax, gave the state huge powers in that regard, and actually that legislation also provides for very substantial fines for people who don't comply with that legislation. Again, a bit ridiculous. If you can't afford to pay, we're going to fine you, and guess what? Now you really won't be able to pay in that regard as well. So you're given the power to come in and look at attaching and deducting from people's wages. Now, I note that that doesn't apply in relation to your court fine legislation from social welfare wages, which is a good thing because obviously people on social welfare are already on the breadline, but it does raise issues, to my mind, of confidentiality, of privacy. I don't think it's acceptable that employers would be aware that their employee has a court fine that needs to be paid. It is a breach of data protection and an interference, to my mind, that should not be tolerated in that regard. So I do agree and echo the points made by Deputy Wallace in relation to some of the concerns about the newly beefed up bailiff or sheriff's role. It's a little bit ironic that we're given extra powers in relation to the sheriff pursuing court fines when the sheriff has been to the forefront in recent tragic eviction cases and so on, and that whole area is under the spotlight now. So I think it is true to say that yes, people should not go to jail for not paying fines. We shouldn't have that situation. But as long as you have a system which allows fines to be a method of punishment for law breaking, then inevitably people who are poor are going to end up in prison. And people who are wealthy can buy their way out of it. And to me, that is not just, it's not transparent, it's not even. So if you want to make people correct their behaviour, everybody should be treated the same, which means money has to come out of it. And if we're saying money has to come out of it, prison isn't an option, which I don't believe that it is, well then the best method of dealing with these offences is through the area of community service in relation to dealing with this area instead. So I think fines are completely wrong. So allowing you to deduct them from people's wages as an alternative is not a progressive step, in my opinion, and that we would be far better served actually to look at the root causes for why people end up getting fined in the first place. What are the offences which lead them in this direction? And many of them do relate to theft, poverty, drugs and so on, and you would be far better off tackling the root cause of these offences rather than bringing in this double standard legislation which favours the wealthy.